Good morning. It's great to be here with you this morning. My name's Dave, if we've not met before. I'm one of the leaders here at Grace Church. I'm going to be preaching this morning. We're continuing a series that we've called Good News. We've been looking at this for a few weeks now, going, what is the thing that is at the centre of Christianity that makes Christianity worth sharing? What is the good news? And we've spent 5 weeks looking at what that is, like kind of trying to get to the core of that and understand that message, that core message that's at the centre of Christianity. And so if that makes Christianity worth sharing, the question that you should find ourselves asking is, well, then how do we share it? What does it look like for us to be a people who believe that good news in such a way that it shapes what we're like as a church, what we're like as a community, and that we could say, this is the way in which we share the good news with the world around us. And we're going to look over the next 5 weeks at 5 kind of distinct ways in which we as a church seek to live out that good news. Now, some of those I think will probably be relatively predictable if you've been around Christianity at all. We're going to look in a couple of weeks' time about the fact that we speak and that you can't share the good news without speaking. We're going to look at how we act. And then there might be a couple more that maybe slightly less familiar with the idea of living out the good news. We're going to look at how we eat and how we worship and how those things actually relate to living out the good news. But first, and what we're going to look at this morning is how we live. How we live. I'm going to read in a few moments' time from probably a less well-trodden corner of the Bible, a book called 2 Kings. I'm going to be in 2 Kings chapter 5. If you've got your own Bible or you're following along on an app, then 2 Kings chapter 5 is where I'll be going. But all the words of those texts that I'll be looking at will be on the screen behind me. So if you don't have a Bible with you, then don't worry about it. They'll all be on the screen. Let me pray for us before we go any further. Father, we thank you that you have given us good news, that we have all of the things that we have sung about already this morning, that we can have joy because of what Jesus has done for us, that we have hope, that we have a rock on which we can stand, that we have certainty and sureness, that we have forgiveness for all that's in our past, and we have a hope for the future. Lord, thank you that there is good news at the heart of Christianity. And God, I pray that this morning you'd help us understand your good news for us in a way that is deeper and fuller and richer, and that you'd help us to be transformed by that and live in a way that reflects it. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Okay, so 2 Kings chapter 5. And this is a story of a man called Naaman, who's introduced right at the beginning. 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favour, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valour, but he was a leper. It's worth noticing the way that the author here is introducing Naaman. He's stacking up all of this guy's achievements. He was like a commander of an army. He was highly regarded by lots of people. He was highly regarded by the king and powerful people. This is a super successful, super well-known, high achiever. And the reason he stacks up those accolades is because he then kind of juxtaposes them at the end of the sentence. And he says, but he was a leper. Leprosy is a kind of catch-all term to describe a whole bunch of skin diseases in the ancient world. But to be a leper was effectively to be a dead man walking. There was no known cure, and there was no kind of hope other than that you were going to slowly, physically disintegrate as the leprosy took hold on you. I've thought about kind of putting pictures of leprosy up on the screen behind me here. There are none that I could kind of show you and then be confident I wasn't going to get complaint emails about showing you tomorrow. For all of his success, Naaman was a dead man walking. He was going to feel and see his body disintegrate away from him. But the story doesn't end there. Now the Syrians, the people of whom Naaman was the commander of their army, on one of their raids had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. And she said to her mistress, to Naaman's wife, would that my lord Naaman were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy. And the surprising thing at this point in the story is that Naaman is desperate enough to listen to what the servant of his wife says. Because he has this disease that means he's a dead man walking and there is no known cure, he listens. So verse 4, it continues. So Naaman went in and told his lord, the king of Syria. Thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel. And the king of Syria said, go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. And so he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 shekels of gold and 10 changes of clothing. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, when this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you Naaman, my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy. And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking to quarrel with me. Naaman he approaches Yahweh, he approaches the God of the people of Israel in the way that he has probably done everything in his whole life up to this point. He approaches it as a highly successful person and does the things that a highly successful person would do to achieve what a highly successful person achieves. So he drops names, he uses powerful contacts, and he flexes his own wealth. Because that's how he's got everything in his life. That's what he's used to doing, and he's used to doing it well and successfully. And how does the king of Israel respond when that happens? He has a hissy fit. He loses his mind. He starts tearing his clothes. He is afraid of the man who Naaman is. He's afraid of the man who's come to him. He is in charge of the army of a neighboring power that is both more powerful than his own people and is generally speaking hostile. We've already been introduced to them as a people who would send raiding parties into bits of Israel and abduct people. But he also knows that Yahweh, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the God of his people, is not a tame God. That what Naaman is trying to do won't work with his God. That Naaman's attempt at dropping names, of using powerful contacts, and of flexing his own wealth is not enough power or name dropping or wealth to mean that he can leverage God to behave in the way that he wants him to behave. Letters from kings and gifts do not buy the obedience of the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the God of the people of Israel. And so he loses his mind. He's afraid. He's afraid of Naaman, and he's afraid of the God who won't do what Naaman wants. And so, while he's having his hissy fit and tearing his clothes, word of this reaches the prophet who Naaman had originally come to seek, Elisha. And so verse 8, this is what it says. But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel. And so Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. But Elisha sent a message to him, saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean. If you are committed, if your mind and your heart are captivated by Yahweh, by the true and living God, by the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the way you see the world is different from the way everybody else sees the world. And so, That's what you see borne out in Elisha. Elisha knows full well, just as well as the king of Israel knows, that God is not a tame God, not a God that you can come to with money and with power and with influence, and you can make him do what you want to do. But neither is he scared of Naaman, because he knows that God, and he trusts that God, and he knows that God is powerful and has given him something that Naaman, with all his power, could never take away. He's not scared of him. And so, he treats Naaman on the grounds on which he comes to him. But he doesn't treat Naaman on the terms that Naaman wants to be treated. If you approach the God of the universe on your own terms, on the terms that we would by default, we will always approach the God of the universe in the wrong terms. Naaman comes to God offering sacrifices, offering money, offering clothes, offering influential letters. And the prophet doesn't even come to the front door to address him when he gets there. He just sends a servant and he tells him, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times. Now, that instruction to Naaman of go and wash in the Jordan 7 times to cure this incurable disease that you are experiencing, we have a problem understanding. Because that to us, if you had an incurable disease and you said to somebody else, I desperately want to be healed of this thing, and they said to you, do you know, I think you could be cured of this disease by going and washing in the Jordan 7 times. Do you know what? That sounds 3 things to you and I. That sounds exotic. It sounds difficult, and it is spiritual. It is exotic, as you and I we normally wash in a shower or a bath. We do not wash in the River Jordan. It is exotic. It is difficult to do. I don't imagine any of us are just going to wander past the Jordan River on the way home after church today. And it is also sounds spiritual. The idea, like you and I probably don't have 7 showers before we go to bed at night or when we wake up in the morning. However, Naaman, when he hears this, has a problem with it because it is not difficult enough, it is not spiritual enough, nor is it exotic enough. Check out verse 11. Naaman was angry, and he went away saying, behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me, that he would stand in front of me, that he would greet me at the front door at least, and he would call upon the name of his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. I thought it was going to be more spiritual than what he's asked me to do. It keeps going. Are not Abana and Pharpar? I have no idea how you pronounce that. Nobody has an idea how you pronounce that. But Pharpar sounds nice, doesn't it? Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel. Could I not wash in them and be clean? I thought he was going to ask me to do something more exotic than what he's asked me to do. The Jordan's just there, and it's not that clean. So he turned and went away in a rage. But his servant came near and said to him, my father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, wash and be clean? Naaman's servant knows Naaman well enough to know that he is upset because what he's being asked to do is not difficult enough. He knows that the person like Naaman wants some great task to climb the highest mountain, to ford the widest stream, and then you will be healed. And he's been told, go and take a bath in the river at the end of the road. And that's not difficult enough for him. But this servant manages to persuade Naaman. Naaman is desperate enough that he does what he's told. So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Naaman, in that moment, learned something that millions of Christians have learned since, and millions of us are still learning now. That God's grace, his mercy, his forgiveness, his healing, his cleansing, is not something that we can earn. It's not something that you can receive by putting God in your debt, so he has to give it to you. It is only something you can receive, and in receiving, you owe an infinite debt to God. And you know what? If you grasp that, if you really understand that, then what is offered in Christianity is in fact far more exotic, far more difficult, and far more spiritual than even what we had hoped for from spirituality, from exoticness, and from difficulty. It is more exotic than we could have imagined because it does not just go to a far-flung place or an exotic location, that salvation comes from eternity. It comes from the God of the universe down to you. It is more difficult because just like Naaman learned, it takes the humility to go, I can only receive this by not trying to earn it. That everything else in my life that I have achieved by my own graft and achievement is a method I have to give up on now, and I have to let his healing, cleansing, and salvation come to me. And it is more spiritual than we might have thought, because it is not something you are able to break down into a process. It is not something you are able to simply replicate and say, do this, do that, and then do this, and then you will be cleansed. No, only by personally meeting with the living God can his salvation come to you. You see, there is something deeply spiritual going on here. The way this is written is supposed to make us realize there is something deeply spiritual going on here. Leprosy in the Bible was always associated with uncleanness, and not just kind of physical uncleanness, but a spiritual uncleanness. The two probably longest passages about this in the Old Testament are Leviticus chapters 13 and chapters 14. Leviticus chapter 13 is all about how do you identify leprosy in somebody. And then Leviticus chapter 14 is all about if somebody happens to be cured of leprosy, even though nobody knows how to do that, even though it would be a complete miracle if it happened, if somebody is cured of leprosy, Leviticus chapter 14, this whole chapter gives the details of how if that person is cured, they then need to become spiritually clean as well. Even though they're physically healed, they're still spiritually unclean and they need to make themselves clean. But do you notice, look, if you've got the Bible in front of you open, have a look at how many times it doesn't just say healed, it says the words clean in those last few verses I read. You see, not just looking backwards in the Bible, if you look forward in the Bible, in Luke chapter 5, Jesus is approached by a man who has leprosy. And the man says to him, I know that if you would will it, I will be clean. And Jesus says, I do will it, be clean. But if you read that carefully in Luke chapter 5, it says, I do will it, be clean, and then he is healed. In Leviticus, you might by some miracle be healed, but then you need to become clean. But then when Jesus meets somebody who's got leprosy, he makes him clean and then he is healed. And here, in between those two events, Naaman's cleanliness and his healing happen together. He is restored because there is something deeply spiritual going on. And when that happens, all of Naaman's categories are just blown apart. His brain just dribbles out of his ears. He doesn't know what to do. Have a look at it. Verse 15. Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company. He's still doing what he did before. He's still coming with all of his wealth and his power to him. And he came and stood before him, and he said, Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel, so accept now a present from your servant. But he, that's Elisha, said to him, As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. And then Naaman said, If not, please let there be given to your servant, to me, to Naaman, 2 mule loads of earth. For from now on your servant will not offer burnt offerings or sacrifices to any god other than the Lord. In this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant when my servant goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm. and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. And he," that's Elisha, "said to him, go in peace." At first, Naaman reverts to type. He comes to the prophet with all of his wealth. He's doing the same thing. And Elisha has to tell him once again, no, I'm not here for your stuff. God doesn't need your stuff. Elisha refuses it. And so then instead, Naaman does something really weird. He says, "Can I have 2 donkeys worth of dirt?" What is that about? Well, we know he knows because he says it. He knows that now he's experienced, there's no other God other than your God. I'm convinced that Yahweh, the God of the people of Israel, the God of the Bible, is the only God there is. There cannot be any other. But he also knows that I live in a world, and I'm going to return to a world where people worship all sorts of other non-gods. But now I have experienced this. I'm convinced of this. It means that I do not want to live in the way I lived before. I want to go to that place that I was in before. I want to live the life I lived before, but I want to worship in an entirely different way. I want to live in a way that is towards the Yahweh God, the one God who is the true God of all, and not towards those other gods. I know that there is no other one, he says. What Naaman is learning to do already, and what you and I need to learn to do, is to learn to worship where we live. It is to live. What does it mean for us to be a people who understand the good news is at the center of Christianity? To understand that is something that makes Christianity worth sharing. And then to go, well, okay, how do we do that? The first thing we need to do is we need to live. There are 2 characters in this story who do that. There are 2 characters who live. One is at the height of society, and the other one is the lowest in the world. But both of them are worshipping Yahweh where they live, or they're trying to. And by doing so, both of them lead the world towards Yahweh. How do we reach the world that needs Yahweh? We live. And Naaman is an incredible example of how people experience that. Do you see the journey that he goes on through these few short verses, really? You could break it down like this. There's a table behind me. First of all, we encounter Naaman as somebody who was great. And he was the commander of the army of Syria. He has nothing to do with the people of Israel. He lives in a foreign land and worships different gods to them. But then, in a point of desperation, he comes to realize that there does exist the God of these people, but the God of these people, well, these people are just there to be captured, there to be fought with, to be oppressed and enslaved. And then at his desperation, when he hears what they have to say and when he goes and sees what their God is like, even in his desperation, he's angry about it. He's got all sorts of objections to it. He's got reasons why he doesn't like what they have to say. And then, after that, after his anger is over, he then thinks of them as inferior still. The rivers of Damascus are better than the waters in Israel, aren't they? But then he gives up the fight and he receives cleansing. He is healed. And then he gets to a point where he can say that there is no God in the earth like the God who's in Israel. There's no other God like this one. And do you realize that is the journey that almost everybody who becomes a Christian as an adult actually goes on? They begin in a place where they're probably going something along the lines, I actually don't know any Christians. I don't really know anything about this. And then they get to a point where they go, well, I did meet some Christians actually. And I found out that, but then I thought those Christians would be really weird. I thought didn't think I would want to associate with them, that I wouldn't belong amongst them, and I couldn't trust those people. But then I actually got to know them a bit more, and I realized, well, at first I realized they weren't all weird, and actually then I realized that a few of them weren't weird. But for all of that, I do think their Christianity that they believe in is somewhat irrelevant and untrue. That don't all religions really lead to God? How could you believe in Christianity when there's as much suffering in the world as there is? But then I got to know them a bit more, and I realized that all of these Christians, they're not idiots, and that they're not evil. And so then I started realizing that maybe I do belong here, actually. I kind of liked being around these people. And maybe I like it, but I don't think the gospel is actually true. I don't think what they believe. And I think I'm a good person, really. But I'm beginning to realize that these people, who I do like being around and I maybe belong with, they believe something different to what I believe. And I'm starting to think I belong here. And actually, what they believe that's different to what I believe, it is making sense to me now. And maybe it is true. And what do I do about it now? I actually think I believe this of myself. And do you know what? This place has become my home. These people have become my people. And I want other people to belong here. I want other people to believe. But the prophet Elisha would have never been able to lead the commander, Naaman, to the God Yahweh if the servant girl had not lived. There is a tiny suffering servant at the center of this passage who moves in and out of it in almost like a sentence and a half, but who is the heroine of this story. And actually her story tells you the story of the Bible over and over again. That forgiveness is offered to people who receive it freely, but is incredibly costly to the people who give forgiveness. She's introduced as somebody who has come into the servanthood of Naaman's wife because of raiding groups that have gone into Israel from Syria, which means that her family and her society, at the very best, were captured and sold off, at the worst, died in front of her eyes. And then when she finds out that the person who is fundamentally responsible for that, arch-commander of the armies, Naaman, has an unhealable skin disease, she could easily satiate her own pain by letting him suffer and watching every finger fall from his hands and going, that is nothing compared to the suffering that he's inflicted on me. But she doesn't. Instead, she speaks about him with mercy and kindness. Oh, only if he knew that there's a prophet in Israel who could heal him. In doing that, she is showing you the story the Bible shows you over and over again. That forgiveness, mercy, that grace are freely offered to the people who need it, but it's incredibly costly to the person who does the forgiving, the mercy, or the grace. A story that ultimately comes most apparent in Jesus. The final suffering servant who dies on a cross looking at people who are supposed to be his own people, most of whom claimed to worship the God for their whole lives who he actually was, some of whom claimed to be his friends but who had abandoned him or even in some cases betrayed him. And he does it in order to offer them forgiveness. One author puts it like this: on the cross, God is doing on a cosmic level what we do when we forgive. There, God absorbed the punishment and the debt for sin. He paid it so we do not have to. That is the gospel. That is the thing that makes Christianity worth sharing. And so it means that we live. Where does that happen? In this story, the people, they do not live in the presence of the prophet or in the temple at the heart of Israel. They live scattered into the world that God has sent them into. Do you notice, it's a subtle detail in this, but how high the understanding of God's sovereignty of where people are is? Remember, if you're reading this passage and you're one of the people of God in the Old Testament, you're going, the people of God are the people of Israel. The enemies of God are the enemies of Israel. What did we read right at the start? It said that God had given victory to Syria through Naaman's leadership. That God is sovereign over where everyone's gone. Even the defeats of God's people at the hands of God's enemies, God is sovereign over. Naaman is where Naaman is because God has put him there. And this nameless servant girl is where she is because God has put her there. You are where you are. You live where you are. You work where you are because God has put you there. And that means that we need to live. What it means for us to live and reach the world around us is that we need to be people who depart from this place with something, like Naaman did. Do you know what it means that you need? You need a jar of dirt. Naaman asked for 2 donkeys' worth of land, of earth, from Israel. By the way, if you don't understand that reference, I'm not going to explain it. Just let it go. So that he could go into the temple of a foreign god. He could go and be surrounded by people who are worshipping another god, and that he could take dirt with him, he could take the land with him, and he could worship the true and living God when he knew that people around him weren't, and when he used to go into that place, he didn't. He knew that he was going to the place that God had appointed him to go, and when he went there, he needed to live the way that God had made him to live now. That nameless servant girl had gone into the house, the home of Naaman, the home of her enemy, and she lived. From the highest of society, Naaman, to the servant of a king, to the servant who's at the bottom of society, a slave, in fact. The people of God are supposed to live. We need to leave today with a jar of dirt. You can't have this one. This is a bottle of milk that cost me a ludicrous amount of money. But are you taking your jar of dirt with you today? Because if Christians, if we do not live, if we do not take a jar of dirt into the world that God has put us in, well then, the prophet Elisha would have never told the commander Naaman about the God Yahweh that he needed to meet if the servant girl had never had the chance to do so. What does that mean for us? I've gone too long, so I'm going to do this fast. Listen up. It means that we live in places from the highest to the lowest, shaped by the God who has put us there. We live in the place that Jesus has put us in the way that Jesus has put us there. Let me tell you 2 stories shared with the barest minimum of permission. I'm just going to embarrass these people because I'm pretty sure if I'd have told them the full amount, they'd have said, no, don't make it all about me. Let me tell you about a Naaman in the church. James, who many of you know, who was playing guitar earlier, a couple of weeks ago was standing in front of a group of anaesthetists from across different bits of the country, talking about how the dignity of human life means the consequences of what's currently going on in the country about assisted dying has deep and profound impacts. He was trying to take his jar of dirt and to throw it on the ground in front of people who do not worship the same God as he does. We live. But also, let me tell you about Laura. Laura, again, who many of you know. Laura, who during the summer holidays one day, just before term started, she had like half a dozen kids from around on her estate. Because their parents weren't around, it was the summer holidays and they needed somewhere to go. And because Laura, in her home, on a very ordinary road, had taken a jar of dirt and thrown it on the floor with her, those children had a place to play safely and to have fun together and a responsible adult around with them, and they had food in their stomachs and joy in their hearts. Laura had thrown a jar of dirt on the floor and had said, in this place God has put me, I will worship the Lord. James had said, in this place God has put me, I will worship the Lord. What do we do to help the world around us discover the good news? The first thing we do is we live. And that means that what we see, what we understand the church to be doing is far broader than we might think. If you said, Dave, Grace Church really needs to do Grace Church really isn't doing anything about assisted dying. No. We honour, love and regard the Jameses of this world way too highly for that. And if you said, it's a real shame that Grace Church doesn't do anything for the kids who have nothing to do during the summer holidays. No. We honour, love and regard the Lauras of this world way too highly to dismiss things like that. Does it mean we don't want to do any more? Absolutely not. And in fact, the Jameses of this world who would hear others wanting to do more would be the first to go, yes, join me with your jar of dirt. And the Lauras of this world would be the first to go, yes, join me with your jar of dirt. But the first thing we do is we live. Are you taking a jar of dirt with you away from you this morning? Are we going to leave this place? Are we going to leave this place like as if we were Naaman, going, that was great, thanks, I'll take the healing, didn't even cost me the clothes, the money, or the servants that I brought with me, I'll go back and live as I was? Or are we going to take a jar of dirt with us? Are we going to live? I think that's the call for us this morning. Do we live? Can I invite you to stand? We're going to pray. Lord God, we take this as a moment to thank you that you are the kind of God who forgave us in a costly way, who stood in a gap for us, who sacrificed himself, who became the least so that we could know the one who is the highest. That you truly did seek and save lost people like us. And God, we are sorry and we confess that sometimes we have taken that good news to be so cheap, to be so easy that we haven't changed because of it, that we haven't lived. And so, God, we come to you now and we say we want to take a jar of dirt with us today. We don't want to leave this place unchanged. We don't want to leave this place unwilling. We want to live. We want to live for you. We want to live the way that Jesus lived in the place that Jesus has put us. Amen.